turn to that. That's where our lesson this morning will take place. I remember the days when there were hurricanes here, and Google Earth is a very interesting thing to look at if you've never looked at it. You can actually put an address in, and it will show you a street view of what you're looking at. The houses all the way around, you can see that. I put in my address, 801 North 10th Street, Carlsbad, New Mexico. That's what I remember as a kid. And I put it in on Google Earth, and I could see my old house. I had lots of memories come back. Lots of memories. I can remember playing catch in the front yard with my dad when I wanted to play baseball. I can remember my brother Jamie running across the road in front of a car, and I had to turn my head because I couldn't bear to watch. Of course, the car didn't hit him, but I remembered that. I remember getting a bike and riding it up and down the sidewalk there. I remember a tarantula, which I was from New Mexico, crawling across the backyard, and my dog barking at it early one morning before I went to school. I looked at those pictures, and all those thoughts and memories kept flooding back. And it gave me a good feeling, a warm, peaceful feeling of remembering 50, 55 years ago, 60 years ago when I was a child. It's good to remember where you come from and to think about where you are now. This morning we're going to take a look at Joshua. As I said in class, we're going to talk about remembering. Remembering. That's very important. Joshua was a great leader who followed Moses. And under his leadership, Joshua had great success. Joshua and Caleb were one of the 12 spies that went into the land of Canaan. And when they came back, Joshua and Caleb knew that they could take the giants. They talked about all the good things that were in the land. And they were the only two that survived the next 40 years under the age of 20. Joshua was took the Israelite people and went up to the river Jordan. And the Bible says that the water opened up, very similar to the Red Sea. And all the people walked across into the promised land. And in verse 4, we're going to start reading about that. Joshua chapter 4, verse 1. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe, and Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan. Take up each of you a stone upon your shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When he passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever." And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded. and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood. And they are there to this day. The people waited 40 years to cross that Jordan. They walked across on dry ground. And God told Joshua, I want you to do this. I want you to pick a man from each tribe and go get a stone out of that river. Carry it on your shoulder. Bring it over here where you're camping and set it down. These stones will be a reminder of what happened today. God wanted the Israelites to remember. And when their children grew up and they said, what's all those 12 stones for? Then you can tell them. This morning we're going to look at this text and I'm going to apply it to our lives. The lesson today is remember where you come from. Remember where you come from. I'm going to ask 3 questions. The first question: why is it so important for God's people to remember? You see, all the way back to the beginning, God wanted the people to remember. Look what's written right there. It's to remember. That's why we partake of the Lord's Supper. God has had this theme in his people even all the way back to the Israelites. He wants them to remember. He wants us to remember what's in the Bible. He wants us to remember all the stories in the Bible. He wants us to remember a lot. Here, what we just read, God commanded them to get these stones. And then the Israelites asked the question, what are we going to do with these stones? What are they supposed to do? Where are we supposed to put them? God told Joshua that these stones had a purpose. And here's what they did with them. When they made their first stop that night in the Promised Land, they stacked them up and they created a landmark. Many people might call it a statue. Why did people build the Washington Monument? Why did men build the Lincoln Memorial? Why did build the Texas Monument near Houston? It's to remind people of the past. When you see it, you remember. This is what God's purpose was. He wanted the people to remember that they crossed this water on dry ground and they entered into the Promised Land. Look what it said in verse 21 of chapter 4. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall tell your children. Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over. So that all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. That's why. A reminder. These stones that were taken up from the river, they had a clear purpose. They were going to serve as a reminder, a remembrance, a memorial, a landmark God had wanted everyone to remember how awesome that occasion was and how powerful God was. God could stop a moving river. And he stopped it. God wants us to have a good memory. He wants us to remember what he's done for us, just as he wanted these people to remember. We won't be able to tell others, though, if we forget ourselves. You see, have you ever forgotten to tell someone something important? I know Harley has that problem. And we all have that problem. Have you ever forgotten them? Oh, I forgot to tell you. I do that a lot. And Tammy would be elbowing me if she would listen to someone else talk. We all have that problem. When you forget to tell somebody something. We take the Lord's Supper each week. The bread and the fruit of the vine. Why did God tell us to do that? To remember. Don't ever forget what Jesus did for you. That's why we do it. But we also have an obligation to tell others what we remember. And if we don't remember, then we can never repeat it. I remember my grandmother telling me when I was a little boy about how she grew up on a Kansas prairie in the late 1800s. And she had a horse, and how they would feed the cows and dig through the snow with a rope tied behind them because the snow would pile up over the house. She actually lived in the cowboy days. And I never forgot that. But my children and my grandchildren are never going to remember it if I don't remember and share it. We've been told in the Great Commission to go out and tell the world of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But how can we tell anybody anything if we don't remember? God knows our human weakness. And we all have a weakness to forget. And I know I have to write notes down to try to remember things that I forget. We are living in the here and now. In the here and now, I'm afraid that forgetfulness is a part of our life. God knows that. There are several things that can happen to cause us to not remember, that will cause us to forget. And this leads to the second question that I'm going to talk about this morning. Why do we tend to forget? I'm going to give 3 possible answers, and there could be 100 more. But these are the ones that I thought of. Number 1, we live in a hurry. We are constantly in a hurry. And I think I could write a book about being in a hurry. It was even worse when I was working. I never had time. I was always on the go. And when we do that, we tend to forget important things. I remember one time I was working, and I remembered it was my anniversary. I had forgotten it. Things like that when we're in a hurry seem to cause us to forget. I think of the story of Abraham and Sarah. God had already told Abraham, and he's an old man. He's older than any of us in here to this moment. He was probably around 80 to 90 years old. And his wife Sarah was just as old. And he told him, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Sarah's going to have a son. They got in a hurry. Sarah was in a hurry. We got to help God. Do we really have to help God? Because we live in a time, even our government thinks that we're supposed to do things in the name of God. Does God need our help? God can do anything at any time when it is the right time. But we know the story that Sarah gave Abraham her handmaiden. And she had a son named Ishmael. Because they were in a hurry and they wanted to answer this. You know what the problem was that? Isaac was born, then there was conflict between the two sons, and then Abraham sent Ishmael and his mother away. Ishmael became the father of a great nation. Can you guess what great nation that Ishmael became the father of? Of the Arabic nation. Now think about this for a moment this morning. With the things that are going on in our news today, what would Israel be like today if the Arab people had never existed? The very people that hate them. They're kinfolk. They all came from their father Abraham. When we're in a hurry, we tend to make mistakes. We tend to forget everything we've learned, our successes and our choices, because when we're in a hurry, we forget. Number 2. Why do we tend to forget? Because we're helpless. We get in a state and a place in our life when we need help. We don't know where to turn to. There's a popular idea in the religious world today. It's called the daily miracle syndrome. It's an idea about life that is promoted by all the TV evangelists. And it is a lie. It is a lie when they tell you that miracles happen every day. All you have to do is have faith and you're going to become rich. And you're going to be blessed beyond your imagination. But they're blessings that they tell you are physical blessings. Miracles are miracles because they only happen once in a while. Not every day. Occasionally God intervenes in the laws of nature and causes something to happen that shouldn't. I remember many years ago, and I had an aunt whose name was Mary. She was a member of the church. She had surgery because she was having problems. They opened her up, and she was completely covered with cancer. They couldn't do anything. They sewed her up, told her, "You have 6 months to live." My Aunt Mary lived for 10 more years. That's a miracle because the doctor said she shouldn't. What's interesting about that is that during this time of her 10 years, my Uncle Cliff became a member of the church. He was baptized into Christ, and he became a member up to his death. You see, God had a plan. She lived 10 more years when she shouldn't. That was a miracle in itself. But these are things that don't happen every day. You're not going to see a miracle every day. The only miracle that is given you is the fact that you wake up and you have the life that you have. God is not going to part the Red Sea every day for every little problem that you have. Sometimes we have to live in those problems. Feelings of helplessness will cause forgetfulness. And sometimes we forget all the blessings that God has already given us. Have we ever been there? I have. And I believe that all of us have. Sometimes we feel that way, and when we do, we forget. Number 3, why do we tend to forget? We forget when we're hurt. When we're hurt and we're disappointed about things in life, our memory of good things, they get foggy. It's as if they're not there anymore. We tend to forget the important things like salvation, kindness, gentleness. When we're hurt, we throw out all the qualities of life right out the window. Because hurting people also hurt people. If you're hurting, you're going to hurt others. We forget. The hurts in our lives make us do dumb things. And if you'll be honest with yourself, you can look at yourself and realize there are times in our life when we hurt and we did stupid things. We forget our children. We forget our grandchildren. We forget everything because we're hurting. The thing that we need to remember is that when we are hurting, we tend to hurt others. Because we have forgotten what God has done for us. It's important for us to continue to lay stones of remembrance. How important is it for you to do things in your life that brings remembrance of what God has done for you? All this leads to the last question. What kind of stones should you be laying? What kind of landmarks do you have in your life? Romans 6 verse 17 says, "But thanks be to God that you were once slaves of sin and have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. And having been set free from sin, you have become slaves of righteousness." If you are a child of God this morning, you've been set free from sin. Jesus' blood cleanses you all the time. You've been set free from that. That's a stone of remembrance that no matter what comes your way, Jesus has already saved you. Many people say that if you're saved, it should take all your problems away. That's not true. It doesn't mean that you don't sin. It doesn't mean that you don't fall short. It doesn't mean that you don't get in a hurry, and it doesn't mean that you don't hurt and that you have struggles in life. It means that God saved you, and that's the stone of remembrance. We should be laying those stones of remembrance. I'll give you an example. You don't have to remember everything. I remember the day that I was married. I remember that I was scared to death. I remember Tammy being scared. I remember my mother-in-law crying and Tammy started crying. That's all I remember, but I remember that, and I should remember that to the day I die because that was a milestone in my life. What about you? What is your stone? One of the stones that you should remember is the day you were saved, the day that you were baptized into Christ. I remember a little bit about that. I remember stating in front of the congregation that I believed that Jesus is the Son of God. And what I do remember, when I went down under the water, I kept my eyes open. because I wanted to see Jesus because I knew he was there with me. Those are things that I remember when I become a Christian. The things that we need to remember is what took place on the cross 2,000 years ago. We don't have to remember every little detail of what Jesus went through. But we need to remember. Romans 5 verse 7 says this, "For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare to die. But God shows his love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." We wasn't a righteous person. And none of us were a good person. We were sinners. But Christ died for us. That's a stone of remembrance. One thing that we got to have in our life are these stones. And one of them is a stone of conversation. We ought to be living our lives as an example, like one of those stones, that when people see that stone, they ask about it in our life. Why are you a Christian? Why do you do what you do? Why are you different than the world? It should be a stone that people see, a landmark in your life that causes people to ask. But for people to ask about our life, we got to remember. We got to remember where we came from. All of us that have been baptized into Christ, remember that we were once lost. That's where I came from. But now I'm saved. And my sins are taken away every day. That's what we need to remember. When we look back and remember what God has done for us in good times, but especially in bad times, then we can know that he can help us right now. When you're in a hurry and you're hurting, and you're going through a trial, remember the mighty hand of God. God, in our text, told the Israelites, look at the stones. I delivered you from the Red Sea, and I delivered you again into the Promised Land. Just don't forget. That's what God says. What about you this morning? Do you have living stones in your life? Do you have spiritual high marks that you can look up to? Deuteronomy 4 verse 23 said, "Take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God which he made with you, when he made a carved image, the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you." You know why? Because when you forget is when you get lost. We should never forget. I remember the house I grew up in. I remember as a little boy watching my family get ready for worship. I remember when my mom and dad gave me a haircut, they gave me a flat top. I remember getting into a 1958 Chevrolet Biscayne to go to worship. I remember playing baseball, as I said, in that yard. I remember my dad going up and down the road, and I went with him and hold the papers, and he invited people to worship up and down the road that we lived with. I remember the stones that my dad laid. What about the stones that I've laid? I hope that my kids and my grandchildren remember my stones. How's your memory? Are you too much in a hurry? Are you helpless or hurt? Are you overwhelmed that causes you to forget, that causes you not to remember what God has done for you? This is what I want you to remember this morning, and the lesson is yours. God has not moved. He is still there. He has always been there. And that same God is calling you back to Him. And you know what He says? Remember me. That's what God wants. If you're hurting and you're troubled, remember the gospel. Remember the death that Jesus went through, and that He was buried and He rose again. That is the good news. That is what we look forward to, for we will all die and we will all be raised again. The lesson is yours. If you remember anything from my lesson this morning, remember, don't forget what God has done for you. If anyone has a need, we're going to ask you to please come as we sing this song.